Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Sally Davies, an editor at Aeon magazine, and it's my pleasure to host today's brochure meetup about the opportunities, challenges, and ethics of xenotransplantation, that is, the transplantation of non-human cells, tissues, or organs into humans. So, some very quick housekeeping before I introduce the topic and our guests. The meetup is going to last approximately an hour. So in the first half, we're going to hear presentations from our panelists, and in the last half hour, we'll open up the floor for discussion. So please feel free to drop some questions in the chat, both as we're presenting and when the Q&A is open. So turning to our topic, organ transplantation represents one of medicine's great triumphs, having evolved from an experimental procedure to the standard of care for end-stage organ failure. Yet, despite significant advances in surgical techniques, immunosuppression protocols, and organ preservation methods, the world faces a persistent and growing crisis. In the United States alone, over 100,000 patients await organ transplants, and approximately 17 die each day whilst waiting. Xenotransplantation has recently moved from theoretical possibility to clinical reality. The transplantation of genetically modified pig hearts into human recipients in 2022 and 2023 marked watershed moments in the field. Such progress brings renewed hope, but also introduces complex questions. How do we assess and mitigate the risks from infectious zoonotic diseases? How might these advances affect our understanding of death and personhood? And how do we ensure equitable access in a world where xenotransplantation might well transform the economics of organ replacement? So to address these questions, I will now hand over to our panelists to introduce themselves and give their presentations. Jay, over to you first, if you would.
Well, thank you, Sally. My name is Jay Fishman. I'm the head of transplant infectious disease at the Massachusetts General Hospital and a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Bob, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself first, and then we will go into my presentation.
Let's do that. Bob, if you can bring yourself in, and then we'll go back to Jay.
Sure. So I'm Bob Truog, and I am a pediatric intensive care physician. That's my clinical work. My academic work has been in bioethics. I started the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School, and one of my main interests over the last many decades has been participation in how we come up with rules and guidelines for transplanting organs, as well as our definitions of death.
Thank you so much, Bob. Jay.
So what I'm going to try to do is give you a high-level view of what we think about in terms of making xenotransplantation work. And I assume you're seeing this in the right view right now. What we really want to do is, can we make xenotransplant work for patients with organ failure? And what will be the impact of that on organ supply, nationally and internationally? Are we going to be able to freeze organs and ship them around the world? What is the problem of organ shortages? Well, we have over 100,000 people on our wait list, and we do about 25,000 transplants a year. And every 10 minutes, somebody gets on the list, and 20 people die a day who could have benefited from an organ transplant. Now, as a community, we're not doing everything we could. For sure. We could do better disease prevention in terms of hypertension and diabetes and the like. We could treat diseases better, and we've seen that with hepatitis C. We could start doing genetic therapies and stem cell therapies. Artificial organs are interesting, but they're not quite ready yet for clinical application. And then, of course, there's always been the question of animal organs, but there have always been immunologic and metabolic incompatibilities that make that less likely. So I think we'll start the story at the end, because this isn't a pie in the sky kind of issue, and this has just been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But basically, a 62-year-old man, very nice individual, had no further access for clinical dialysis and was offered a kidney transplant from a pig, and that occurred on March 16th, 2024. And just to show you, this gentleman made urine on the table and had no immediate complications, suffered some graft rejection, which we treated, and unfortunately died of accelerated heart disease, which would be the expectation of many diabetics who are on the list who wait 5 or more years for a transplant. He was carefully chosen, but as I say, patients over the age of 50 with diabetes on dialysis and belonging to O and B blood groups are going to have a poor chance of survival. They're going to have a beta 40%, 50% chance of dying on the wait list. So we don't have enough organs. And the survival on dialysis, as you can see in the black line here, isn't very good. So we really want to give living donor or deceased donor organ transplantation as an option to our patients with kidney failure and ultimately with other organs. Now, you may say, okay, why pigs? Well, it turns out that pigs are very well characterized. They've been bred commercially for thousands of years, that the genetics of pigs have been worked up, and we can manipulate the genome of pigs. They have resistance to some common human infection, but they have some immunologic barriers, some disadvantages in terms of some of the sugars and glycans on the surface of their cells. Pigs have been thought about for use for years, and I just put on this timeline the fact that I've been working in this field since 1997 or before, when we cloned the porcine endogenous retrovirus from pigs, and published the timeline of opportunistic infections and allotransplantation back around 2000. But only in the last few years has this become a potential clinical reality. And as my friend Alan Kirk likes to say, if we want to do something different, it requires a different approach. We have to think differently about it. So I'm going to show you the conclusion slide early, and then you can think about it as we go forward. But the opportunity of xenotransplantation is that we have many sick patients waiting for organs, and there are certain centers now that are studying pig organ transplants. We have begun the process, both academically and commercially, of safe pig breeding, both in terms of genetic modifications that I'll talk about and screening for infection. And so the putting together of these safe pigs with the medical centers that are doing this kind of research suggests that we can do this technically. Now, the real question is, can we save lives? We know that there are risks. There are infectious risks, immunologic risks, other metabolic risks, but it's possible. I've just shown you the slide, and we've just done our second kidney transplant at Mass General Hospital from a pig. What are the societal consequences and acceptance? What are the ethics that are involved? How different is the risk in xenotransplantation from the risk in standard human-to-human or allotransplantation? Now, we know that infectious risk is an equation. It's what you're exposed to, or epidemiology, and this thing we call the net state of immune suppression, which is all the risk factors that make you as an individual more susceptible to infection. So it's these two things put together. There are barriers to pig to human transplantation that I won't go into in detail, but that can cause rejection of the organ within minutes or over time, over days, months, and years. So what has happened is that genetic engineering has come and allowed us to knock out some of the immunologic barriers, to put in some human genes that reduce the impact of metabolic incompatibilities, particularly around blood coagulation and complement deposition. And then, from my perspective, allowed us to knock out the porcine endogenous retrovirus, which we think is at some potential risk to humans because there are receptors on human cells, so that 59 copies of that gene were knocked out. And so these are so-called genetically engineered pigs with up to 69 gene edits. Now, that's a lot of work, but it was made possible by the Nobel Prize winning work of CRISPR-Cas9, the gene manipulations. And then we screen these animals for potential pathogens, a term that I developed called designated pathogen free, which just means I made a list, and I'm on a list of everything that I think is likely to cause infection in these individuals based on my experience in allo or human-to-human transplantation. Now, how great is that risk? Remember I mentioned the net state of immune suppression. Well, what we've learned from our studies in non-human primates is that you need a lot of immunosuppression. You see it on the right-hand side of this slide from a very nice paper by Mohammed Mohideen, which suggests that we delete B cells, T cells, complement, and activation of the immune system up front. And then we have long-term maintenance immunosuppression that hits all of those areas, plus adds anti-inflammatories. So these are very immunosuppressed individuals. And so each time you hear about a xenotransplantation package, if you will, or trial, it's about the immune suppression, the organ that we're taking, what the patient needs, and how carefully those individual pigs have been bred. The infectious disease gaps are the obvious ones. Do we have assays for the things that I've put on my list? Can I tell you if they're there or not? Do we have antimicrobials? Can we get rid of those infections if they occur? And most importantly, what don't we know? What they used to refer to as the unknown unknowns. And so what we don't know, for example, could emerge as have recent infections from the markets where you sell pigs, because most of the novel pathogens we're seeing now, including SARS-CoV-2, have emerged from places where there are pigs and birds and people and amphibians all put together and exchanging DNA. And you probably know about swine influenza and other potential pathogens. So I made a list, and it's a long list, and this is only half of it. But we're particularly concerned about viruses because we don't have the assays, we don't have the therapies, they're activated in transplant, and they're prominent with the immunosuppression that we use. So we have a list, we have knockout pigs, and then what don't we know? We don't know what people think about this. So we need to educate the public as well as the medical profession about what it is we're doing. We need validated assays. If we're using advanced genetics, we need sequences. So sequence data, which go into a big library, which we don't have all of. Infection control practices. What do we do in the hospitals or for the patients where we are doing xenografts? And equity and inclusion. How are we offering these therapies, not just to our own people in the United States, but around the world? How do we address the organ shortage in that way? So we have some validated assays. We have some viruses that are of concern, and I won't go into these in detail other than to say that some of them are pig specific, but still cause problems like graft rejection. Some of them might infect humans, but we've never seen human infection due to these viruses. So we have to say, even though we've identified them, including the porcine endogenous retrovirus, we've never seen human infection. But when I cloned the porcine endogenous retrovirus back in 1997, the field shut down. So that what we need to do is be very, very careful, or as Tom Starsel says, get to the point where we're not introducing new risks, and figure out good ways to address these infectious risks up front so that the medical public and the general public can find these acceptable. How did we get rid of PERV or porcine endogenous retrovirus? Genetically engineered source animals, which you may have seen on in some of the media. So where do we go? We do know now what some of the infectious risks are. We can breed animals safely and try to exclude those. There are still things likely that we don't know about, new pathogens that we may not understand. We need to address infection control procedures for our staff to make sure that everybody is safe. We need to have a careful grasp for the Food and Drug Administration and regulatory authorities around the world on what risk we are posing for our patients so that we can recognize the potential of xenotransplantation. So let me stop there and turn the floor over to Bob, and who will talk about some of the ethics of what it is that I've been doing.
Thank you so much, Jay. Bob.
Okay. Can you see my slides now?
We can see them, although they're slightly obscured by a window. Yep, there we go.
Oh, but you're not seeing you're seeing my presentation view?
Yes, and we're seeing the presentation, not the full screen.
All right, let me just try one more time. Better?
That's better, thank you.
All right, okay. I'm going to talk about a couple of issues here. First of all, Jay, that was a really nice overview. I learned a lot about some of the downstream consequences of this really breakthrough technology. Okay, so as it's been said several times now, in the United States, approximately 17 people die each day while waiting for an organ transplant, 6,000 deaths annually. The shortage of organs has required the creation of a method for rationing, since we don't have enough for everyone. And this is called the match run. I've been on the ethics committee for our organ transplantation system for a number of years, and this is constantly revised in terms of ethical considerations. Basically, characteristics of the potential recipient as well as the donor are put into a computer. You generate a list of patients. You start at the top, you offer it to the person at the top. If they can't accept the organ, it goes to the next one, and so on down the list. And the algorithms are designed to allocate organs based on both the urgency of the need, that is the likelihood of death, for example, within a short period of time for the patient, as well as the potential for benefit. Now, against this background, porcine organs will potentially create an unlimited supply of transplantable organs. So what will be the consequences of that? Well, first of all, we'll get rid of that whole waiting list. Everything that we've been doing for years will disappear. But now patients who are poor candidates and who would be very unlikely to receive an organ under the current system may be considered eligible for transplant. And patients may receive transplants at an earlier stage of organ failure, for example, as an alternative to dialysis or to improve health from earlier stages of heart failure. So, you know, as many of us know, life on dialysis is terrible. And when a person reached the point that they would need to go on dialysis in the future, that may be the point where they would receive a xenotransplanted kidney. Or for patients with heart failure, why wait until you are very sick and a high-risk surgical candidate to get your heart transplant? Why not get it sooner? Or for people who are dying of old age, who want to do a Hail Mary and get a transplant and see if they might be able to live for a few more months. All of these things will now become questions that we're going to have to face. Furthermore, these organs will create economic challenges. Currently, organs are relatively cheap. I believe around the world, donors are not paid for their organs, or at least should not be paid. We have this ethic called the gift of life, that when you die and you give your organs, it is a gift. So the only costs of transplantation now relate to the surgical procurement and transplantation of the organ. On the other hand, porcine organs are likely to be expensive. Maybe Jay can help us out here. I've done a little research. I can't find any estimates as to what they are going to cost, but I expect it's going to be significant. Once organs are no longer needed to be rationed based on scarcity, therefore, we will need to determine who will receive them and how to pay for them. And I think that that's going to be a terrific challenge to the current systems that we have in providing medical care both in our countries and around the world. So that's what I was going to say about that. Shall I go on and talk about the second consideration?
I think let's talk about the second subject, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Okay. The second way that I think organ or xenotransplantation could affect our current system is around the social constructions that we've developed on how we define death. So, in some sense, death is really fairly straightforward. If you look at this painting by Rembrandt of the anatomy lesson, it's very obvious that the person on the slab there is dead. The problem is that when patients die in the usual way or are dead like this, their organs are just as dead as they are. You cannot use them for transplantation. And so the central challenge of organ transplantation has always been the need to obtain living organs from people who have been determined to be dead. We need people who are dead enough that we can legitimately consider them to be dead, but alive enough that their organs can be used for transplantation. And so in order to do this, we have created two liminal diagnoses that exist between a state of living and dead. And we call these death by neurological criteria or death by circulatory criteria. Let me just briefly state how we do those. So death by neurological criteria, or what we commonly call brain death, consists in applying these valid diagnostic procedures that we have for determining when a patient has irreversibly lost consciousness, will never wake up again, and the capacity for spontaneous respiration. They will never breathe on their own again. And we can be highly confident when we make these diagnoses. And when these criteria are met, we consider the patient to be brain dead and their organs may be legally removed. What's the ethical concern here? These individuals are not dead in the traditional sense, but they have sustained a severe and irreversible neurological injury. And so as the debates have gone on, some critics, and they're increasingly vocal, argue that these patients should be considered neurologically disabled rather than dead, and that they deserve the protections that we provide to other disabled people. In other words, it turns this into a conversation about disability rights. The second way that we determine death for transplantation is by circulatory criteria, and here's how that goes. Life support is withdrawn, which is typically a ventilator, from a patient who is in an ICU, who is dying, and the family has decided to withdraw life support. We wait until pulselessness occurs, that is, the heart stops. Then we wait an additional 5 minutes because we know that the chance of the heart restarting on its own after 5 minutes is virtually nil. We then pronounce the patient dead and proceed with organ procurement. What are the ethical concerns here? After 5 minutes of pulselessness, many patients could be resuscitated if we attempted to do so. We don't attempt this since these patients have a do not resuscitate order. But if attempted, in many cases, it would be successful. So therefore, we can't consider that the loss of pulselessness is irreversible at this time, as is required by law in the United States and by many people as an ethical principle. So we have problems with DCD as being in compliance with both the law as well as what many people would consider to be an ethical requirement. Okay, so my last slide here is that these debates about brain death and circulatory death have been endless over the last 50 years. They started when transplantation began in the back in the 1970s, the 1980s, and they have persisted. They've been problematic, and so recently our Uniform Law Commission in the United States met for 3 years, from 2020 to 2023, to try to resolve some of these areas of controversy. It was a total failure. The commission abandoned without any progress. Forcing organs would eliminate the need to obtain living organs from people who have been determined to be dead. All of these controversies would go away, and there would mercifully be an end to these debates. So there's my ethical thoughts about how xenotransplantation might affect other areas.
Fascinating. Thank you both so much. There's a lot to unpack here, so bear with me while I try. And I do invite other participants. Please do feel free to drop some questions in the Q&A, and we will pick those up. So I guess I want to start with a somewhat naive question. This is probably more of a one for Jay, but you know, in your fascinating presentation, you kind of obviously lay out among the many things we're doing to make these procedures possible is the genetic engineering of pig organs. I'm curious, given the development on the other side of the ledger, not in relation to xenotransplantation, but there is obviously moves towards developing clinical interventions using CRISPR for humans. Is there any kind of work or research on genetically modifying the human recipients to make them better recipients of xenotransplanted organs, or is that really science fiction?
I don't know that it's so much science fiction because I think people are using CRISPR and related technologies, gene editing technologies, for single mutations in neonates and in utero. But I think that topic I find scary, to be honest, because it harkens back to the World War II and to the Nazi manipulations of genes. And I think that I'd like to stay away from the notion that we're going to be engineering people other than for disease curing. And I'll give you one example, which is sickle cell disease, which is if we could relieve sickle cell disease through a genetic engineering technique, these people would have better lives, pain-free lives, stay out of the hospital, and could go on and have children and suffer none of the consequences of sickle cell disease. And there are many other less common, but other single gene mutations. I don't think anybody would quibble if we could do that safely. And I'd say genetic engineering has its own issues in terms of how do you introduce the genes and what kind of viruses you use to do that. And we can talk about that. But I think the idea of engineering the recipient to accept an organ would be considered troublesome by the medical community. Bob may have stronger opinions about that than I do, but I'm worried by the notion of genetic engineering of hosts.
I would completely share those thoughts. But could I ask you another one that I imagine is on some people's minds? So last night, my son and daughter-in-law are visiting, and she's a medical student, and I started to talk a little bit about what we're talking about today, and at one, about how these pigs are raised in these sterile facilities, etc. And she said, "Stop, I can't. I don't want to think about this anymore." And I'm thinking, well, what's going on? And I think that there's this visceral reaction that people have about using pigs, which are some of the more sentient, and you can train them like dogs, and and of course, we kill probably several billion pigs a year for food. And so, at one level, I think that's just a silly ethical concern, right? I mean, if we really took that seriously, we would stop eating them first. And yet it seems that somehow this does evoke a reaction among people that we're using them in this medical way that somehow feels like it should be impermissible. I'm sure you've had people say that before, Jay. I mean, what do you think about that?
So I think it's a very reasonable concern, although I have to say that if you're using pigs as a food product, using pigs to save lives seems to me eminently acceptable. So that I think if you reject one, you have to reject the other. But the notion isn't foolish. I mean, people have their own beliefs, and these are, sentient animals. And the idea that you use any animals for the benefit of humanity may be unacceptable. But as I say, I think that you have to apply the same standards to food where these animals are not raised in lovely conditions as compared to what the places where they're raised for xenotransplantation, where the animals are socialized, comfortable, sterile environment, have toys to play with and the like. So these are if there is such a thing, happier pigs than the pigs that are used for food. Should we be doing it? I think you have to make your own ethical judgment on that. I would say that each of the major religions has weighed in and accepted xenotransplantation. So I was on a panel at the Pontifical Academy for Life recently, and we said basically that this is acceptable in Catholicism, but also the recent surveys of all the major religions. So I think you have to make your own decisions. I think you have to factor into that whether or not taking an organ from another person who may have died due to unforeseen circumstances, whether that is more acceptable than taking an organ from a pig. I don't think there's right or wrong answers here. I think there are personal answers there.
I mean, it's interesting. We have got a few questions coming through about the ethics and the responsibilities we might owe to the pigs who are involved in these transplants. And you mentioned, Jay, the fact that these pigs are raised in sterile environments doesn't mean that they're not given rich experiences. And in some ways, you think that those environments are better than the environments that they're raised in when we grow them for food.
Well, if you've seen pig farms where there are thousands of pigs raised in large crowds in rather unsanitary conditions, it's not that those pigs are unhappy. I don't know. I haven't talked to any of them. But the reality is those are not environments where you'd say this is a rich experience. I think the people who have been breeding pigs for xenotransplantation have taken that responsibility very seriously. But I do think that people have to make their own judgment. It's about whether or not this whole area is acceptable, and it may not be to certain individuals, and that's fine. It's like anything in medicine. You make your own judgment, but then when you develop organ failure, the question is, how do you feel? And confronted with these kinds of things, people often change their views of the universe or for their families. And that's unfortunate, because if you need a kidney or a heart or a lung or a liver, you should get that if you need that to survive and have viable life ahead of you. We can't do that right now. We don't have enough organs. So that's the balance.
I want to pick up on a couple of things you said in your presentation. One was you mentioned obviously this notable breakthrough, if as it were, in 1997 of cloning the porcine endogenous retrovirus, and the whole field shut down. So I'm kind of curious, like in the intervening years, what's changed that now makes proceeding acceptable?
So we cloned that virus. I had found some literature from Japan which showed morphologically by electron microscopy that there was a virus in pigs, in normal pigs. And so we went into normal animals and cloned it. It turned out to be one of the variants of this virus. And it turned out that other people did some very nice work, Clive Patience and others, that showed that there was a receptor on human cells for this virus. So we had a virus, we had a receptor, and theoretically, we could infect human cells, except it's never been seen on normal human cells. It was only a in vitro or laboratory phenomenon. And certain cell lines that were not normal could be infected with this virus. But even pig farmers and people who work with pigs have never been infected and don't even have an immune response to this virus. So we thought that the risk was low, but it took the genetic engineering of pigs to exclude this virus to really reopen the possibility. Now, some individuals are doing clinical trials without excluding the porcine endogenous retrovirus and have seen no infection. I worry downstream that something could happen. So I feel safer if the virus is just excluded. That said, we've tried to exclude dozens of different bacteria and fungi and viruses to try to make this safe, because we have experience in human transplantation that suggests they're at risk for certain kinds of infections. But what shut the field down was a knee-jerk response by regulators, but it wasn't unreasonable. What brought it back was also a response by regulators and say, okay, we seem to be in a better place. Plus, we then had data to suggest that humans had never been actually infected with this virus.
I'm really, yeah, really, really interesting. I'm going to slightly pivot here to you, Bob. I mean, picking up on the question of these ethical debates about xenotransplants, and I mean, you mentioned, for example, that the shift towards xenotransplant would sort of end the scarcity of organ donation, potentially even kind of end the necessity to have these endless recursive debates about death. But I mean, realistically, isn't it likely that we'd actually have a period of time where we'd have years of both human organs and xenotransplants being used? And wouldn't this actually create kind of more ethical complexity in the crossover period?
It's an interesting question. I guess you'd have to make the argument as to why we would continue to obtain organs from humans. It's an entire industry which is built around this. You know, transplant surgeons procuring the organs, flying them other places. The United Network for Organ Sharing has come under great scrutiny in our Congress recently about inefficiencies in the system. Maybe I'm being naive, but porcine organs just seem like an absolute fix for what is a really messy system right now. You know, we've got concerns. I mean, a lot of the stuff that our ethics committee is working on right now has to do with patients who would feel coerced into agreeing to having their organs removed. You know, we have a system in the United States where if you check a box on your driver's license, your family is not consulted if you become a potential organ donor. I mean, your organs will be taken. These create all sorts of problems for families. So I guess maybe I was thinking, boy, this is going to be the solution. But then, you know, it's like the lid comes off the box at that point, because now it's a potentially unlimited resource. And I mean, why would anyone be on dialysis anymore? Dialysis is horrible. As soon as you have kidney failure like that, why wouldn't you want one of these transplanted kidneys? And you know, like I said before, you know, people with early heart transplant, why wouldn't they want a new heart earlier? So I don't know that they would coexist. I think it would. This is so superior. It would seem that it would become the preferred option for everybody.
I mean, maybe Jay can speak to this. I guess my thinking was simply that there might be different risks and benefits. Okay. I mean, I thought it was really interesting, Jay, you know, talking about the need for significantly more immunosuppression for xenotransplantation. And I was wondering, you know, does this create a sort of catch-22 where the stronger immunosuppression that you need in the patient then increases the kind of unknown infection risks that you identified?
Yeah, I think it's a very astute question, because the reality is and we're still learning about the immune suppression, so I should use that as a caveat, but if we have to use very intensive immune suppression, then just what we have in the environment, in the air, is going to cause more infection in these recipients. So that if we're not able to get down to what I'll call a more normal level of immunosuppression for transplant, then the risks of infection, what we call opportunistic infections, infections that wouldn't normally cause infection, is higher. And so, yes, there is that risk. So that I think that we're not there yet, and we'll see as we go into clinical trials, some of which have been approved recently, prospective clinical trials, where we can address some of the issues about immune suppression and how little can we use. And we need long-term survivals before this becomes the standard. But just to go where Bob has gone, we're now working on technologies to freeze these organs so they can be shipped around the world and thawed and used. That means we can have like an Amazon.com of organs, and you'll get a little box that has your sterile organ in it for transplantation in daylight by a skilled surgical team. So that the dynamics may change, but it also may change in terms of equity, because we may be able to ship organs to places that don't have human donation as part of on a religious basis, or don't have the infrastructure to do organ transplantation allocation. So there's some exciting things that could happen, but I think you're right, Sally. I think these are going to coexist for decades because we're not there yet. And so we'll be able to ask these ethical questions for a long time. There is one question in the question and answer that I'd like to talk about, because there's a very nice thing when I said clinical trials and it was translated to cynical trials. The would the participants have the right to withdraw, because we monitor these people for infections? And the answer is we say no, but you can withdraw from any clinical trial. All you have to do is not show up for your appointments, so that we don't have that level of control, which is why we have to make it safer. We have to make it so that if somebody says, I'm tired of seeing Jay, I don't want to come anymore to clinic, they have to be able to do that. And so that's part of the progress. I think the other piece of that is posed very nicely by my friend Renzo Pegoraro from the Vatican, who asks how to manage risk assessment for zoonoses and how do we educate the population. And we need to do that. We need general education to make this both acceptable and so that people know what they're getting into as part of the informed consent process. If I'm going to give Bob a pig kidney, he's a very smart guy. He's going to ask me some questions, and I'm going to have to tell him I don't know the answer to some of these questions. And what we want to do is have those answers and have them in the public so that Renzo can tell his people, Jay has addressed these issues seriously, and we have education. And I actually have built a public education PowerPoint slide set so that we can teach people about xenotransplantation, so that things that they need to know for informed consent.
I think there's an interesting question from Gwendolyn Quinn here, which is kind of why does this piece about the broader education of the public matter beyond the immediate person and family member? I mean, what I understand you to be saying, Jay, is if these procedures become more routine, you kind of get a head start on being able to obtain that informed consent if the kind of notion of xenotransplantation and its implications and ethics is sort of part of a broader public conversation, rather than having to undertake that as a clinician at this crisis point when you're deciding to do the procedure.
So I think Bob may have some opinions about the idea of public versus individual education. I see individual education as part of the informed consent process, so you know what you're getting into. I see public information as making this acceptable, because if I give you a pig kidney and then send you off to college, are your roommates going to say, I don't want to live with you because she has a pig kidney? That's it's an extreme concern, but it's a real concern, which is acceptability. And so there's religious acceptability where, the Jews and the Muslims and the Catholics and other religions have said this is acceptable in terms of saving a human life. There's a completely different thing that says this has a certain yick quotient to it, where I don't think we should be getting into it. Bob, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that, the fears and skepticism of the public around anything that has to do with gene editing are huge. And I think you just even, in the soundbite world that we seem to live in now, you say the words and people go nuts. I mean, look at some of the work that's been done with, genetically modifying mosquitoes, for example, to prevent, transmission of deadly diseases and not in my backyard. And so, yeah, I think that the issue of having people in our society who are going around with these genetically modified organs, and you don't know who they are when you're walking down the street. Who knows what you might be exposed to. I can just imagine a lot of paranoia and misinformation that could get in the way of this.
I mean, I'm interested in this is perhaps a bit difficult to do, but what are your respective predictions about when the average patient is likely to benefit from this technology? Because, I mean, it's obviously still very much in the experimental phase. patients have only survived a matter of weeks. How long until we're routinely seeing pig hearts kind of extend people's lives by years?
Decade.
A decade.
We have to work out a whole variety of things, and you're going to have to work out things for each organ differently. Suppression and long-term care, metabolic incompatibilities, those kinds of issues are going to emerge over time. So I think that that's going to happen, but as we see more, we'll learn more. So there's going to be exponential learning at the same time as we're saving more lives. So I think that is goes hand in hand. The science needs to be joined to public opinion and to our learning about this technology. But it's not going to happen overnight, and not everybody can do it. First of all, not everybody can do organ transplants, but not that many centers, for example, have what we have: decades of experience in non-human primates and decades of experience working with pigs. It's not completely straightforward. The commercial entities that have gotten into this, and Bob raised the question of cost, really need this to be routine for them to make back their investment. I think they will, but I think it's going to take some time.
Well, I'd actually really love to pick up on that subject of kind of this new political economy of xenotransplantation. Because, of course, the fact that these would become routine procedures, would be a fundamental shift to the economics of it. And I'm curious to know kind of what frameworks might you propose for how to decide who gets organs and who pays? I mean, obviously, this is still hypothetical, but I'd be curious to know if there's any kind of speculative proposals that ethicists are discussing that it might be worth placing on the table here.
Yeah, well, I think our current history is not very encouraging in that regard. I think that if you can afford it, you can get access to expensive treatments that have little potential for benefit. And there's very little in the way of sort of oversight that would say, no, I'm sorry, and I know I know that you can afford this, but it is insufficiently beneficial. There are other people that could benefit more than you. Maybe they don't have as much money, but in fairness, they should have access before you do. We are terrible at this. I think the issue of, I hate to use the word feudal because it has so many ramifications, but the treatments that we provide that have very little opportunity for benefit, I think, already out of control. So I think this is just going to aggravate the situation, to be honest.
I mean, the question of an Amazon for pig organs raises the question of sort of who is the Jeff Bezos of xenotransplants, slightly horrifying and dystopian scenario.
Jay, I don't think we're going to lose the need for an allocation system, at least initially. If we have enough organs so you can get them like an aspirin, then the price will also come down. And the standards for raising pigs and for organs should be higher. And so these are now regulated, as for many cellular therapies, as drugs. And so regulatory authorities like the Food and Drug Administration will set standards for what a safe organ is. That needs to happen. And the FDA is already involved in approving our clinical trials. And they ask us very detailed questions about how safe and how long and informed consent and the like. So they are being quite rigorous, and they should be, in this area. The question of quality control, right now, we're very careful because we think a bad outcome would be bad for the whole field. So everybody's being very careful. Are there going to be unscrupulous individuals who try to make a profit out of this? If you say no, you're not giving humans very much credit. I would think yes. And so we've got to be very cautious about how we move this field forward in particular when there are economic motivations for profit. And that's the one thing Bob didn't mention, but we all live under this umbrella where nobody makes any money off of organs. And that's how it should be, in the sense that you can't make money, and so nobody's getting rich off of organ transplantation. That's an important safeguard, and we have to make sure that gets continued.
You know, one of the questions was so interesting for me, Jay. The meetings of our ethics committee right now have turned to questions about what do we do for patients who are opting for a xenotransplant. Do they come off of the waiting list? If the organ fails, do they then become eligible for a kidney from a deceased person? And it surprised me just from reading the New York Times that, in fact, some of these questions have already been answered, in that the person I understand who was transplanted at Mass General was put on inactive status in terms of the transplant, but would still get credit for waiting time if that organ failed. That was my understanding.
Yes.
It's not clear to me where those decisions were made, because I think all of those are currently under discussion. And one that didn't come up, but I think maybe should be considered, is should we consider the people that opt into this system to be somewhat medical heroes, in that they are, perhaps submitting, themselves to what could be a fatal procedure when they don't have to, and that if for whatever reason the organ fails, they should have the highest priority for a deceased organ. So all of these things I think are sort of up in the air, and the recent transplants that have been done have kind of pushed the questions. And and I'm reading about the answers to some of these questions in the New York Times when I'm not even sure where they've been discussed.
My bias is that people who volunteer in general for novel medical procedures that are well controlled are in some ways heroes. They're certainly risking their lives, not for themselves in general, because they may get no benefit from this, but for the general public in terms of benefit. And this applies to any kind of therapy, cancer therapies, heart therapies, organ transplants, and the like. So we basically feel the thing about xenotransplantation is we know these individuals intimately. They've been in our clinics for years. So these are people who become friends. We wouldn't want them to be exposed to something that placed them at risk. And at the same time, it is an experimental procedure. We don't know if it's really going to work, so that they do need to stay on the wait list in case this fails. Should they be moved up? Well, that's going to be done on a national basis in terms of should they be considered people who are desperate in need of an organ. And we do that already, because if they have no access for dialysis and their kidney fails, they're going to die. And then it's a decision of the institution as to what should happen to those individuals. I think we need to, as a society, we need to embrace medical research, but we need guardrails. We need to protect the individuals. We need to protect society in case there are infectious risks. And we need to keep going back to the Nuremberg rules, where we say informed consent takes a certain status, that these people need to be protected, even if they don't understand completely the technology that's being involved. I think, and that gets back to the question that Sally asked about genetic engineering of humans, just something we shouldn't do. And we shouldn't do it because we've seen this in the past and it's wrong. There are very few things ethically that I feel that clear about, but that seems to be one of them.
I think that this question around allocation and prioritization and ethics, I mean, it raised the question for me just as a matter of kind of scientific and medical progress from the xenotransplants that have been done to date. And I was reading interviews with the families who say they have no regrets and they're incredibly proud of what their family member was doing and indeed consider them medical heroes. I'm curious to know whether the experience of doing those xenotransplants has yielded medical insights that we are actually now implementing to improve regular organ transplants that we're doing on a daily basis. I'm curious, Jay, if you could speak to some of the medical advances that we've gathered beyond merely medical advances that would also help xenotransplantation.
Yeah, I think there's two areas where there are some medical advances. I'll talk to the one that I know most intimately, which is molecular diagnostics. So we're always concerned about the microbiology, and you heard me say, I want to know what these pigs are carrying and the unknown unknowns. Well, there is a field called metagenomics or advanced sequencing, where I can go in and use blood samples, not biopsies, but blood samples, either cells or plasma from the blood, and test it for DNA and RNA, sequence it, and compare it to a database that says this looks like some virus we've seen before or doesn't look like something. And so the diagnostic tools that have resulted and are being applied to xenotransplantation are advances on the tools that we were starting to use in general clinical infectious disease. So metagenomics and then multiomics, where we start looking at protein synthesis and RNA replication and metabolic processes, so we can take a snapshot of an individual to try to tease out what kinds of processes are going on. Is this rejection, infection, some other process? So molecular diagnostics. The other area is immunosuppression. So the backbone of immunosuppression has been for years what we call calcineurin inhibitors, a set of drugs that we use to suppress immune responses by T lymphocytes in particular against the graft. They're not perfect. We have a lot of late rejection and people lose grafts even though they're immunosuppressed and taking their drugs. And so there are new classes of immune suppressants, some called co-stimulatory blockade molecules, other molecules, anti-inflammatory molecules, that we are starting to use routinely in xenotransplantation that are just finding their niche also in human-to-human transplantation. It's not that they don't exist, but we have a broader array of new drugs. Some of these are going to be developed in xenotransplantation and then get brought to the bedside for clinical transplantation and for cancer and for inflammatory autoimmune diseases, so that there is this crosstalk. There aren't so many institutions in the world where this crosstalk can occur routinely. So it's very important that we have communication, that we publish our data, good and bad, in this field. So secrecy is not part of xenotransplantation. If you're going to get in, people are going to see what you're doing.
Fascinating. We've got a question here from Jenny Proof. It's asking whether the immunological issues of xenotransplantation would differ in children with a more naive immune system. And is there any kind of work happening in that area?
Good question. So the immune system of particularly young children hasn't been completely formed yet, but in general, it's pretty stable after kids get to be about a year old. That said, their infectious exposures are much more limited, and they may not have been exposed to some of the things that cause graft rejection. The concern right now is we're not thinking about, I shouldn't say we in general, in the field is not moving into pediatrics right now because of all the long-term risks haven't been worked out. The infectious risk, the best immune suppression. Is there a risk of malignancy with long-term immune suppression of new types? That's not to say that kids wouldn't benefit among the most for certain types of diseases. Congenital heart disease comes to mind, congenital liver diseases as well. Those might be the individuals who benefit most from the availability of correctly sized organs. So that it's not on the table, it's just that in the early phases of this, it's not something we're looking at. But everybody wants this to end up in children because they're the ones who hopefully would benefit the most. But the question, for example, is, will the organ grow properly with a child? Will the heart be the right size in 10 years as it is now? We don't know that. We need to study that.
Fascinating. Well, look, I'm conscious we're coming up to the top of the hour. Bob, I just wanted to bring you in and kind of circle back to this question that you raised at the very end of your presentation about definitions of death. And, regardless of whether we move to a world where xenotransplants become the norm and human organ transplants fall away, I thought what was really interesting about your discussion about death was kind of, it seems to me, as I understand it, that, the need for these fine-grained concepts of death came after the sort of clinical necessity of doing transplants. Like, if I'm not wrong, I mean, the definitions of death came from the fact that we needed a way to sort of justify, that it was okay to take organs from people. So I was curious to know, do you think xenotransplantation is going to kind of create new clinical needs, and how do you expect the definition of death to change to fit those needs, if at all?
Yeah, if you sort of, as Jay says, we're probably decades away from it. But I do think that xenotransplantation has the potential to remove all of the controversies that we've had around determining death. Maybe the one thing that would remain would be that, for example, when we diagnose somebody as brain dead, whether or not they're dead, we fill out their death certificate and we no longer need to keep them in the ICU. And so there is a way that brain death is a way of limiting ICU care to people who are have the potential to recover, right? If you don't have the potential to recover, you shouldn't be in the ICU. And brain death is one way for us to say, nope, you can't stay here anymore. You're going to the morgue. But other than that, I think, we would go back to just sort of a much more traditional understanding of what death means. And indeed, let's face it, these new ways of defining death pertain to less than 1% of the deaths that occur in the country. Almost everybody dies in the traditional way that, they have for centuries or millennia or, even longer. So I think it would be good to get rid of this sort of netherland that we have of in between living and dead, where you're dead enough that we can consider you to be dead, but alive enough that we can use your organs. I think it's not been a great place to be.
Thank you so much. Look, I have to apologize that we've kind of reached our time. There's many more fascinating questions. I'm conscious we've got a fascinating question actually about primates and whether or not this would change the standards of ethical acceptability. Maybe I'll end on this question, and then we'll leave some space for closing remarks. But Jay and Bob, do you have any thoughts on that, about whether or not primates as a source of organs would change the sort of standard of ethical acceptability of these procedures?
So the use of primates has been precluded as a source of organs for human use. Part of it's very practical. They carry a plethora of pathogens that are infectious for humans, and we can't breed them sterilely or humanely for this purpose. And so there aren't enough. It's ethically unacceptable, and the field has decided not to do it. So the use of primates for human use is not, they are a central part of our research effort. But I don't think that there's ever going to be a time where we use primate organs for human organ transplantation.
Thank you. Well, Jay and Bob, did you have any concluding remarks about the overall subject, or should we leave it there?
I'd like to
thank you for doing it.
It's important to ask these questions, and that every time we shake up the field a little bit, it's for the better, because we examine traditional values, and some of those are wrong. So I think this is an extraordinarily valuable type of session. So thank you.
Thank you all for participating. And I do apologize to those of you that we weren't able to get to your questions. I'm sure Bob and Jay would be happy to continue the discussion. Thank you so much for your engagement. And thank you, Jay and Bob, for an incredibly illuminating and challenging conversation that I think will stay with many of us afterwards. So thank you for your participation, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.